Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to our second event organised by the Institute for Women's Health for International Women's Day. So happy Women's Day everyone! And this event is really going to be exciting. It's called Race and Reproduction. And in 2019, I went to a fertility fest event with the same title, almost the same title. And it was absolutely amazing to hear the different positive and negative things relating to race and reproduction. So I'm sure we're going to have a really excellent session today to discuss these issues. So I just want to say a couple of things about the Institute for Women's Health. That's our Twitter handle there, at UCL_Institute for Women's Health. And the aim of the Institute is to make a difference for women and babies' health. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Asma. Asma is a nurse who works in HIV and sexual health research at UCL's Institute for Global Health and is a member of UCL Race Equality Steering Group. And while I did say we're going to launch the survey, while Asma's just getting ready, I've just launched a survey with just 3 questions on that we'd like to know about you. So if you could just click on those while we're waiting for the last people to come. Excellent, we're starting to get the answers in now. And the panel are welcome to answer this as well. We're coming up to halfway with the answers. Excellent. It's always good to know a little bit about our audience, and being someone who teaches a lot, I really hate talking to people or at people. I really like to be engaged with you as much as possible. So we're really looking forward to your questions in the chat, and also we will do a little poll at the end as well. So I think we're almost there. Anyone wants, there's a couple more people left. You don't have to answer. Okay, right, I'm going to share the poll. So the majority of people, almost just over a third, almost a third, sorry, are aged 36 to 40. And the second question was, have you ever felt that your ethnicity has influenced your ability to be heard in health settings? And just over, well, just under half said no, but very close said yes. So 43% said yes. And the third question was, have you experienced racism when seeking fertility care? And I'm very pleased to see that only 7% said yes, 40% said no, 17% said not sure, and 37% said not applicable. So, right, I will stop now and hand over to Asma to introduce the panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joyce, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for participating in the poll. And actually, 7% may not sound like a lot, but that's still a significant number of people who've experienced racism, and that is not okay. Before we start, I just want to say that we're probably going to be talking about some really difficult topics today, including baby loss, infertility, FGM, amongst other things. But please step away if you need to for your own self-care. You might find content could be a bit upsetting, so please reach out to somebody if you feel upset. And I will be looking down at my notes occasionally. I couldn't get my double screen, so I apologize now. And I'm going to start the event by reading out 2 poets that I really, really admire. One is called Rupi Kaur, who's written a book called Milk and Honey, who you hopefully have heard of. If not, go and look her up. And the other poem, which I thought was really apt for today, was Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou. So I've taken extracts from Maya's poem. I didn't want to use all of it. So in Rupi's words, you were so afraid of my voice, I decided to be afraid of it too. And then Maya's extract that I've taken is, now you understand just why my head's not bowed. I don't shout or jump about or have to talk real loud. When you see me passing, it ought to make you proud, I say. It's in the click of my heels, the bend of my hair, the palm of my hand, the need for my care, because I'm a woman. Phenomenal woman. that's me. So thank you to all who identify as women. We should not be afraid to use our voice. We are indeed phenomenal. Okay, those are my opening words. So thank you. Okay, so and today our speakers today we have Lenise brothers, we have Dr. Shema Tariq, we have Seetal Savla, and we have Dr. Sohier Elneil. And before I give them space and to talk about who they are and give them more of an introduction, I just wanted to briefly talk about my experience. So when I was 17, I had an appendicitis diagnosis. And at the time, there were at least 4 male doctors who came in and did a vaginal examination on me, even though at that point it was determined that I was going for surgery and that it was an appendicitis that I had. And no one actually examined my abdomen. They just did vaginal examinations. 4 people came one after the other and did a vaginal exam, no explanation of what they were doing. And the reason I mentioned this is that they knew from my notes that I'd been diagnosed with something called testicular feminization syndrome. So they knew that I didn't have a cervix. I was a really interesting case. And this came about because I wasn't having periods. So my mother took me to the doctor, who then referred me to a specialist. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't know I had testicular feminization syndrome, but these men came in and examined me 4 times. And my mother, who was a Punjabi speaker, sat there protesting. No one heard her. I was too embarrassed to speak up. And I believe that if I was a white teenager with a mother who could speak English, this probably wouldn't have happened. And my reproductive rights were compromised because I was a brown person. So I just wanted to share that with you today as well. And our speakers today are from diverse backgrounds, but in all cases, they are using their chosen subjects to raise awareness and advocate for change. And infertility, baby loss, does not discriminate. It affects people from all backgrounds. But there are different pressures for women depending on the community she's from and how she's treated because of the color of her skin. And as I mentioned, today we will discuss baby loss, stigma of being childless, infertility, female genital mutilation, periods, pain, and pelvic floor, and also being a mother or a parent. And it's also important to mention the racism experienced by minoritized people. A British Medical Journal opinion piece in 2020 showed that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth in the UK, and Asian women are twice as likely to die during childbirth compared to white women. And these findings are from the Mother and Babies Reducing Risk through audits and confidential inquiries across the UK reports in 2018 and 2019. And today we're talking about cis women's experiences. And I hope one day we can include and talk about non-binary and trans people's experiences too. But without further ado, let me introduce Lenise brothers. Now, Lenise is a registered nutritionist who specializes in women's health, hormones, and menstrual cycles, and hosts the Period Story podcast, a program where she talks to women about their first period and the myths and misconceptions about periods. And what I'll do here is give each speaker about 3 minutes to talk about their work, and then we'll go on to questions later. So Lenise, please.
Yeah, so hi everyone. So I am a nutritionist specializing in women's health, hormones, and the menstrual cycle. And I work with patients in my clinical practice. And what I see most commonly come up is issues around menstrual pain, whether it's primary dysmenorrhea or secondary dysmenorrhea. And there is a thread that ties in throughout this around women feeling dismissed and trivialized by their doctors when it comes to the conversation around pain and getting support. But I see it come up, it comes even into even greater focus when it comes to women of ethnic minority backgrounds. And, we have the stats to back that up. And, if we look at, there's a lot of research that shows that there is a bit of a misconception around perceptions of pain, especially amongst Black people, and that Black people are more likely to feel less pain, which we know is not true. And then this ties into how Black women, when we speak specifically in the context of today, are being treated, and the kind of support that they're getting from their GPs, where there's research that shows that Black women are 22% less likely to get any pain medication. And then this translates into the support that they get for issues to do with menstrual pain, whether it's, as I say, primary dysmenorrhea, or secondary, where it's endometriosis, fibroids, adenomyosis, pelvic inflammatory disease. And it then perpetuates an issue where we see this distrust of the medical community, and this reluctance or a delay in trying to get support for the issues that they're facing. So where they feel like they've been dismissed for trying to get support for their pain, so they will likely go and look for alternative solutions. And we could talk extensively about why this is, cultural issues around this, but this is a really important part of my work, and some of the issues that I've explored on my podcast. I have an example of a lady who was on my podcast with endometriosis. She had spent 2 years trying to get referral to the unit at UCL. And it was only when she went to her GP with her white partner was she able to get a referral. And this is a Black British woman. And this isn't a one story. I've heard many stories like this. And it's important, I believe, to have these conversations so that on the patient side, we feel empowered and we understand what potentially we have to face, and that you don't have to delay, but also on the practitioner side, what patients feel and how to work with patients in a more compassionate way. So I'm excited for today's conversation.
Thank you for that introduction, Denise. Brilliant. We're looking forward to hearing more from you. Next, I'm going to ask Dr. Shema Tariq to talk to us, and let me introduce you to her. And I work with Shema, so I know she's an academic and medical consultant in HIV, working with women. I've lost my little piece of paper which tells, oh, I found it, sorry. And she's also a trustee of Tommy's Baby charity. And today Shema will share her personal experience of infertility and baby loss and motherhood as well, I hope. Thank you, Shema.
Thanks, Asma, and thank you for sharing your experience at the beginning of today's conversation. I thought that was so powerful. I feel really honoured to be amongst a panel of really incredible women. So unusually for me, I'm not going to be talking about my work. I'm going to be talking about me and my journey, which has been really quite long and convoluted to becoming a mother. I have 3 children. I have Lyra, who is just about to turn 1, Faris, who's just over 2, and my eldest child, Altair, was stillborn in 2017 at 21 weeks. I have had a very long journey to becoming a mother. I basically had multiple rounds of IVF and then ended up having donor egg IVF and conceived Altair on my 4th round of IVF. And there's a whole other discussion about how difficult it is to be from a racially minoritized community and to find an egg donor. I mean, it's really, really hard to go down this path. with Altair, I developed a very, very rare placental condition, and my waters broke at 21 weeks and we lost him at that stage. I then had to pick myself up and have more IVF. I had another donor egg IVF cycle, and on my 6th cycle, I conceived my son Faris, who is now 2. And then I had a really astonishing, miraculous natural pregnancy 7 months later after having him. I'd been told that I could never conceive naturally. I had diminished ovarian reserve. And I was in my mid-40s and breastfeeding. So somehow I think my last ever egg made a bid for escape and got fertilized on probably one of the handful of times I had sex that year. So Lyra is now about to turn 1. I know, Asma, you asked us to reflect on how our race has patterned our experiences and our work and our reproductive journeys. For me, it was about visibility. When I first started out on the IVF journey, I couldn't see any women who looked like me who were in public talking about this. I know since I started back in 2014, there have been really amazing women such as Seetal who have been very public about it. But at that time, I couldn't find anyone that looked like me, and it felt really isolating. And there are particular challenges that come from being from either Asian or Black communities and going through infertility, and a lot of that's tied up with society's expectations about how you should be as a woman and what constitutes womanhood. And then that happened again after we lost Altair. There's some amazing resources around baby loss, fantastic bloggers, but they were all white. And although there are a lot of similarities in terms of the loss of a baby, I wanted to see a woman who looked like me, and I wanted to see my story represented. So throughout this time, I've been quite open about our journey. I have connected with lots of women on my Instagram account, where I've been very, very public about my struggles with infertility and our journeys after losing our son. And now, I guess, reflecting back on that journey, I've been really lucky to be invited to be a trustee of Tommy's, specifically bringing my lived experience as a woman of colour who has lost a baby to their board, but also my academic experience as an academic who works with minoritized communities in partnership to try and make sure that people are sat at the table equally and they have their voices heard by those that matter. So I'm really proud to represent Tommy's and to be able to bring that experience to their board. And thank you for having me today. I'm really excited.
Thank you, Shema. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm always very admiring of your sharing on social media. Thank you. So the next person that I'm going to introduce is Seetal Savla. And Seetal is a freelance writer who aims to banish the extra stigma faced by women of colour struggling with infertility. I'll hand over to Seetal to tell us more.
Thank you very much, Asma. And thank you very much to UCL Institute for Women's Health for inviting me to share my experiences on this panel, Race and Reproduction panel, alongside such incredible speakers. It really is an honor, so thank you very much. So who am I? I'm Seetal Savla, I'm 39, and I'm a fertility advocate, freelance writer, food blogger, and social and PR manager. My husband Neil and I, we have been trying to conceive now for just over 4 years. Our fertility journey started on Christmas Day 2015, when we found out that I'd fallen pregnant naturally. And unfortunately, I went on to miscarry a few weeks later. Since then, we have suffered 4 failed IVF cycles across 3 London clinics using our own genetic material, with the last one being delayed when clinics closed last March due to coronavirus and lockdown. So after our 4th devastatingly unsuccessful cycle, we decided to pursue donor conception using donor eggs because, like Shema, my diagnosis and our struggle to conceive is due to my low ovarian reserve. While Neil and I are both of Indian heritage, we prefer to move forward with either Portuguese or Spanish donor eggs. And as Shema said, again, that is a separate issue, which I hope we discuss later on. So in January, we were delighted to find out that our UK-based Spanish donor had finally started treatment, and we felt hopeful for the first time in about 6 months or so. Unfortunately, all 15 eggs collected were unviable, which was just a crushing blow. And she has since agreed to donate again, but only in 2-3 months' time, because she started a new job, which is perfectly understandable. So in the meantime, our clinic found another UK donor of Spanish origin, and that cycle resulted in 3 good quality embryos, which we're over the moon about, and they are frozen waiting for us now in our London clinic. So the challenge really is for us to find a time, the best time, to go back to London to schedule a transfer around all the commitments in our new home city of Berlin, where we've been for 3 months. And just to touch a little bit on why I decided to share my story, I wanted to document it as I go along, because as Shema said, there are just so few voices of women from ethnic minority backgrounds sharing their experiences. And I also longed for someone whose story represented my own. I got a great amount of strength when I started sharing, and I want to be able to give that back to especially to the Instagram community, the TTC community, which is where I first started finding out about podcasts and bloggers and websites. So that's one side of it. And also for anyone else, just to offer them support so that they don't feel alone. You don't have to tell your story to social media. You don't have to write an article about it in a newspaper, but just if I can give someone the courage to talk to one person in their entourage about what they're going through, that would make it all worthwhile. So I'm looking forward to this discussion later on. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Seetal. Thank you. I mean, yeah, such moving stories. And thank you to all of you for sharing. I'm going to move on to Dr. Sohier Elneil. And Sohier is a consultant urogynaecologist, and we'll be talking about FGM and addressing the hidden problems of chronic pain and other pelvic floor problems. But what I should have said actually to all of you in the beginning was, if you wanted to share your reproductive story as well, you can do. And Lenise, I'll give you an opportunity later. But so here, if you want to share as well, that'd be absolutely great.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation to be part of this amazing panel. I'm listening to all the stories. So I come from my heritage is, I'm originally from Sudan, and come from a FGM practicing country and community. And one of the things that became apparent to me as an obstetrician and gynecologist, I first trained as a surgeon before doing obstetrics and gynecology, was the realization that women really needed more women to be in the medical clinical base where they could come to. And one of the reasons was I was looking after women with FGM, but also with a condition known as obstetric fistula, where they'd had obstructed labor and ended up with devastating conditions with terrible morbidity. And many of them lost their marital rights, but equally lost their husbands, lost their families, their communities, and also effectively lost a future. And when I first started working in the field, it was really to address some of these really difficult arenas. They're not seen as sexy topics at all. Women who are incontinent or who are unwell or who have sexual dysfunction or who have pain. And over a period of time, it became very evident that FGM women in particular tended to be seen as FGM first and everything else second. So their issues were never addressed as women. It was always addressed as she's an FGM, and everybody's interest was in what type of FGM she had rather than what was her problem. So although many clinics were set up to help women who had FGM with the process of deinfibulation and, trying to restore them to some degree of presumed normality, it became quite clear that the women were not being heard for their other problems. So they were not heard about their infertility journey. They were not heard about their incontinence journey, their chronic pain journey, and so on. And in the culture I originate from, it's expected that you'll be married at the very latest by your early 20s. And it's therefore expected you will have your first child by your mid-20s at the latest, and you would have completed your family predominantly by your early 30s. Now, if you can't have your first child due to the FGM or due to the pain associated with FGM, it becomes a real issue. And it comes an issue at a very young age. So the mental health effect on a young woman in her 20s is phenomenal, and it becomes lifelong. The expectation is as soon as you're married, and because that is how it happens in the society, that within a year, a child should be born. So if a child is not born for several years, that means the end of the marriage, ends the end of the societal role that you have, and the respect that you have within your community. So the implications are huge, and that's not just in the diaspora setting, but it's in any setting. It's the same sort of rules. So one of the things that became quite important for the work I was trying to do was to address the women's issues and stop focusing on the FGM, but focus on what is the problem they had that needed to be supported, resolved, and heard. And chronic pain was one of the first areas that I got involved with, subsequently the fertility journey, and then all the other issues of pelvic floor disorders. What we found is that actually, when you open the door that way round, women were more forthcoming, because we started to see that in the FGM clinics, the focus tended to be just the FGM, and the women didn't feel there was any role there unless they were pregnant and trying to have it defibrillation before their delivery. That was the only focal point appeared to be in the clinics. So we were able to set up a clinic at UCH, and it's called the Zahra Clinic. Zahra in Arabic means flower. And we opened the door really for all women from all aspects and all journeys. Now, one of the issues of being a Black woman, there's an expectation that fertility is not a problem. I'm not sure where that comes from, but there's this expectation: you marry young, you get pregnant, you have children. So actually, if you go, I work a lot in other countries, and in particular in Africa, the issue there isn't fertility and having a baby. The issue there is how to stop women having babies. So there's a huge drive in contraception the whole time. And some of the biggest agency groups globally fund contraceptive massive programs, and less so on fertility programs. Fertility is seen as a luxury item, that if you can't have a baby, that's not an issue to be addressed. We should worry about other things. So that whole mindset shifted, I think, to countries like the UK. And so there's this expectation that if you're unable to have a child, well, that's your call, and it's impossible, but you don't need to do too much about it. So access to fertility services was a real issue. There's also the cultural acceptance of the whole process of IVF. So if you're from a Muslim background, there are lots of features there that people find difficult to accept, and a lot of women from Sudan and Somalia are Muslim. And then all the issues that come with donor IVF as well, because there's all this religious connotation to go with it. So the journey has been very hard and often in secret, which also puts yet another strain on the women. So we are working on changing that narrative. It is very slow. And the first narrative that we're changing is the cultural acceptance of FGM, in the sense that if you have it, it shouldn't be a taboo to speak about it. But if you have it, also you can seek help in whichever domain of healthcare you need, and you should be fine. You should be able to go there freely. Still a struggle, still a struggle. And subsequently, the doors are open, but the journey truly is just beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sohier. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our speakers for introducing yourselves and your very moving stories. Lenice, I didn't know if you wanted to comment about fertility for yourself, or are you happy to talk about your work? I didn't give you the opportunity earlier on, so I'm just giving the opportunity now.
Well, I mean, the work menstrual health and hormone health is reproductive health. My own fertility story is certainly not as moving as these other ladies. I did have a miscarriage, which when I reflect back on it now, I didn't know how to talk about it. Because this was back in 2012, and it was certainly, it felt like a taboo, certainly to me, to be able to talk about it at the time. And I didn't have the vocabulary. I just thought, okay, and I just moved on. But on reflection, I see the work that people like Seetal is doing. She's doing certainly on Instagram, has actually helped me reflect on my own journey and my own miscarriage, and given me the vocabulary that I didn't have at the time.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I mean, I think they're all very moving stories, and we all have our own journeys. And yeah, I'm very in awe of and happy that you're all here to talk to us today. I'm going to move on and direct some questions at the panel. So I want to ask you all the same questions because I want to hear everything you've got to say, but unfortunately we can't do that. So if you feel that you want to comment, just raise your hand and then I can ask you, but I might just stick to one or two people talking about one question, and we can have another discussion at a later point and discuss more if we want to. So can Shema, you were talking earlier on, and I think Seetal may have touched on this too, about your experience of egg donation and being, I'm going to say, being brown. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not often that I talk about egg donation in a public space, not because I think there's anything wrong with it, but I always think it's my son's story to own. But I think it's really relevant to this discussion. So when we found out that we needed to go down the egg donor route, it was really important to me that we found a donor who was from a similar ethnic background to me. My partner's white, so it was really important that for me to feel that I could bond with our child, that they looked a bit like me and they shared some cultural heritage. I've got to say now, sort of going sort of down this path by several years, I don't think that matters actually, because once you have your child, they're your child and you don't really think about it. But at that time it was important to me. And there's very few Asian egg donors in the UK. Our preference was for an Asian egg donor, and we were lucky to find a clinic that had some eggs from an Asian donor in their egg bank, and that resulted in Altair's conception. And then obviously when we lost him, we lost the chance of use. We didn't have any more eggs left from that donor, so we lost our chance there. And I knew it was going to be very, very difficult, and that added to the grief, because I phoned around lots of clinics in the UK, and we were told there weren't any Asian egg donors in the UK and we could be waiting 2 to 3 years. But I just lost a baby, so I had this really visceral need to have another child. I didn't want my only experience of motherhood to be mothering a baby who had died. So it had become very important to move on quickly. So we ended up going abroad, and at that stage I sort of abandoned any ideas of finding a donor who was of a similar ethnicity to me. And I just wanted a donor who would look, it's similar to what Seetal has said, I just wanted a donor who would look a bit like me. So we went to Northern Cyprus, and actually they did find an Indian donor there for us. So we got there in the end, but it was difficult. We did not have the same choice that somebody who was white would have had, because there just aren't any Asian donors really in the UK. And by going abroad, we had to go for anonymous donation, which was not which would never have been my preference. I would have preferred to have done it all in the UK and have non-anonymous donation. And I know that that's going to be an issue that we have to sort of explore with Faris as he gets older. But for me, it was a choice between just not being able to become a mother or doing it this way, which was a compromise for us. And then there's that whole other layer of, you know, people don't talk about egg donation anyway, generally, but they definitely don't talk about it within Asian communities. And I'm lucky my mum has been very supportive, but my father hasn't. And it is difficult. But if anyone is going down this path, and I know that you are, Seetal, what I would say is, you know, as soon as I held my son, any of those anxieties just slipped away completely, and he feels 100% mine. And even though I have an own egg baby as well, I don't feel any differently to either of them. And I see that being a donor egg mum is an enormous privilege. The last thing I wanted to say is that I'm very conscious as I talk about this, about intersectionality, because the reason I'm in this position is because I'm educated and I have money. I was able to go down this route. And so in all these discussions, we just need to be aware of the impact of intersectionality on all our experiences. And, you know, another Asian woman may not have had the resources I had.
Yeah. Thank you, Shema. Seetal, do you want to add? I know you were talking about it earlier, but I'll let Seetal add.
Yeah, I'm not too sure where to start with that. I think in terms of an Asian donor, we ruled that out very quickly because, as Shema said, there are just a very few Indian donors in the UK, waiting lists of up to 2 to 3 years. And I think according to the HFEA, one of the stats that I pulled out was that in 2015, there are 50 times more white women who donated their own eggs compared to women of minoritized backgrounds. So that just puts things into context. And I just didn't want to wait. And I imagine a lot of people in this situation, if you've been through IVF with your own genetic material, it hasn't worked, you're just keen to move on to the next step as soon as possible so that you can start your family and move on with life. And my husband and I therefore ruled out using an Indian donor. We wanted to have our treatment in the UK. It took us a while to find a clinic that we really liked. So we're currently with our third clinic who offers own fresh cycles and also donor cycles. My previous one only dealt with known donor cycles. And in order to work with a known donor, you have to have someone who's 35 or under and has already had a child. And we didn't know anyone who fit that criteria. So we moved clinics to explore the possibility of anonymous donation. But then we found out about non-anonymous, and that is something that we feel quite strongly about. And it's a very personal decision, but Neil and I preferred to have that so that if we do have a child, when they turn 18, they can have access to the donor's information. But when things weren't working out, you know, a couple of months ago, I did think, well, maybe we could go to Spain and go down the anonymous donor route. But obviously now there are so many complications with quarantine and travel bans and crazy flight prices. So, you know, it's a complicated thing. We also, for me personally, there's another reason why I didn't want an Indian donor. And I think it's because if we were successful and had a child, I would look at that child and it would remind me of something that my body wasn't able to do naturally, because it would be biologically 100% Indian, because Neil is Indian as well. And I think that would be difficult for me more than having let go of my own genes, because I would see that reflected back. So having a donor of a Portuguese or Spanish origin, it's similar. They have similar physical characteristics, but it wouldn't be so evident, I think. But it's all very easier said than, sorry, Joyce.
No, sorry, finish. I just wanted to let Asma know I wanted to say something, but finish.
All right. Okay. No, and then just finally what Shema was saying as well, I am also in a privileged position where we have the means to explore all the alternate paths to parenthood, surrogacy as well. And obviously there are a lot of costs involved in that, a lot of people. So I recognize that not everyone is able to do that, and that would be the end of their journey. So it's lack of awareness, lack of education, the stigma as well. Religion comes into play, and then, you know, not being able to afford it. lot of barriers.
Asma, I just wanted to
Thank you, Seetal.
Yeah, I just wanted to say first, thank you all. I really am trying my hardest not to cry. I went through 7 years of fertility treatment for my children. I almost cried last night, and so even when you have your family, that this trauma that you experience will never ever go away. And you've all you know, shared your incredible journeys, which have been, I know from my own experience, already incredibly painful. But this, as Sohier said, this urge for motherhood, I mean, it's traditional as well, but you know, some people don't understand why we would go this far. I mean, I went through 7 years. And again, as Seema and Seetal said, we were privileged people, and all of those people, I feel really, really strongly. I got my treatment free. I actually couldn't have afforded it. I was an academic, but I still feel incredibly privileged. And I really feel for all those people who are not in a position to even start this fertility journey with assistance. And I think it's really, it really breaks my heart. So we've got to try and do something. It's not equal in all countries. Just to say that you, both of you mentioned anonymity. So just to say, in case people don't know, that so in the UK, we changed the rules in 2005 so that any donation through a clinic is now non-anonymous. So the child at 18 will get identifying information about their donor. But as a result, donations really tricky in the UK, as you both said, and finding a donor who's not Caucasian is really, really difficult. And this was something that really came up in the event 2 years ago on race and reproduction. But also, you both mentioned that people and eggs and sperm are now traveling around the world. So in our speciality, we call this cross-border reproductive care. It used to be called fertility tourism, which is a terrible word because it makes it sound glamorous, and it's anything but glamorous. So we do have the issue that anyone, as Asma said, who's brown is just offered a Spanish or Cypriot or some of the other countries that have big egg donation programs. They're offered one of those donors, and it's really problematic. But I just wanted to finish my comment here with mentioning sperm donation and just bringing in one question. So my PhD student, Rena, is on board, who's doing a PhD on men's infertility, especially around race. And I just wanted to ask all of you, how do the men feel? So Asma and Seetal, I'm sorry, Seema and Seetal Shema and Seetal, who have had some treatment already. How did your partners feel? Because as women, we feel unsupported. As brown women, we feel even more unsupported. But men, traditionally have been really unsupported. And there's a great movement in the UK now to try and change this. And we're just about to launch a survey asking UK men their attitudes of having children and family building. And I think it's really important to hear about the men. So how are the men, your partners in your life, coping, and how did they cope when you went through treatment?
Seetal, do you want to start?
Should I take that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's to give you a bit of background. My husband was actually the one who was ready to start a family before I was, a few years. And then when we had the natural pregnancy and I miscarried, that was the moment for me, the catalyst to make me realize that we hadn't had any sort of accidents in 8 years of marriage. And actually we needed to urgently investigate the issue because we hadn't been taking any precautions. And so we went for all of our tests and everything. And for the first couple of cycles, my husband internalized all the emotions. I found it extremely overwhelming. We just were swept along. We did our first cycle on the NHS. Then we went to a private clinic that our friends and family had recommended because they'd had success there, which is known as IVF boot camp, to give you an indication of just how intense it can be. And because of that, he was my rock, he was my support, and he just suppressed everything that he was feeling. He administered my first injection when I couldn't, did the 2-inch progesterone injections as well. while I was crying, and it's just really difficult for him. So he didn't really vocalize any of that. And he wrote a really lovely article in the Metro for Father's Day last year talking about his perspective. So I can share the link to that later on as well. But since I've been speaking openly about it, and I've kind of become the face of our infertility as a couple, I've been able to get a lot of strength and build up resilience as a result of that. And we have flipped the situation, and I can be there for him, give him the space to express his emotions. I think that is quite difficult because the focus is on women. A lot of the treatment does happen to us, you know, the injections and the scans and everything. But, you know, we shouldn't sideline the men because they're equally involved. They also have dreams of having a family. And so, as Joyce, as you were saying, it is fantastic to see so many accounts, so many men on Instagram speaking out about this. There are fertility support groups as well, closed groups. And it's not necessarily a solution that works for everybody, but it's good to see different avenues available.
Thank you, Seetal. And Shema, do you want to add anything?
I guess, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Seetal has said. I guess I can see it from a different perspective as well in terms of baby loss, because a similar thing happens there. So when you lose a baby, almost all the focus is on the mother. And yes, of course, there's a lot of physical and emotional trauma, especially when you lose a baby very late in pregnancy. But when it happened to us, I felt that no one really asked my husband how he was, and he wasn't perceived as a father. I almost had to fight to be recognized as a mother once I'd lost my baby, which is one of the reasons why I was so public about it, and is a reason why I always say I have 3 children. Now, my husband is naturally more, he's less open about this kind of stuff, like many men. And so I think for many years it was very difficult for him to find a space to grieve, to be perceived as a father. And Joyce, what you said about the trauma staying with you really resonates. We are still picking our way through that. And it has taken a huge toll in terms of our mental health and also our experience of parenting. And I would say now we're only just beginning to emerge from that. But it will be there, that shadow will be there throughout our parenting lives.
Okay. Thank you, Shema. And I just want to say, as somebody who's in a same-sex relationship and not the person that's actually going through the fertility treatment, I'm always trying to advocate equality for different types of couples. I think it's important to recognize. So thank you both for sharing your experiences. And it's difficult for partners who are in the background because you want to focus on the person going through the treatment. I know for me, I want to focus on my partner, but then I'd suppress how I feel, and then it doesn't really work well in that. But yeah, exactly. Thank you. So what I want to do, I know we're running, the event's running quickly, and I know people want to ask questions too, but I want to ask Lenice and Sohier to give some comments. I've got some questions, and I'm not going to be able to ask all my questions, but I'm going to have to meet with you all again another time. So linking on to what Seetal and Shema were saying earlier on about being brown women and the difficulties around egg donation. I mean, Sohier, you were saying about how there's the cultural acceptance or unacceptance in certain, you mentioned the Muslim community, but I'm guessing there are non-religious communities, but also other Hindu, Christian communities who have similar issues. And you said you were changing. How are you changing the narrative for this? You said you were.
So the focal point, so what normally happens within communities, I'm originally, as I said, from Sudan and from a Muslim community, is that if the woman is unable to conceive naturally, there's been an acceptance about the IVF as long as it's your own genetic material. But if you're going external to that, then the attitude is much more, well, if it's the man, it's the woman who is told to seek another marriage and vice versa. So there's a sort of a breaking up of the couple in order to seek help to conceive and to have a family. So, which is quite hard and very harsh. So I grew up with, you know, we all in our family had the uncle and aunt who didn't have children, and they were the ones who decided to stick together. They adopted sometimes the child of a sister or a brother who they brought up as their own, and so on. So that was one of the things we saw as we're growing up. A lot of my generational group, if they were unable to conceive, they would have gone through the whole your genetic story, but most of them would have stopped at the donor cycle actualization, because it was seen within the community as not being acceptable. It's an area that is really, really hard to deal with. So there's a whole other group who are now pursuing it, but pursuing it in secret because they do not want the community to know it. And obviously being of a Black background, but you know, they are looking for similarities, the color of the hair, the skin tone, etc. Very difficult to get. And again, as I've heard from Seetal and Shema, exactly the same problem. There's hardly any donor eggs from people of a similar community. And even if there are people who wish to donate, there is a restriction culturally, socially, even familiarly to do so, because it's all about, you know, you don't share your genetic material unless it's done in a particular way. So the mental impact on women is phenomenal. So you do tend to see we have to educate them more. So as we've done with FGM, sort of educating the community more, eventually driving out the whole concept culturally, but now having to work under broader aspects of this, you know, the fertility journey, when do you get married and all this sort of stuff. So ending child marriages coming into it, because a lot of the girls were tended to be married under 18 and so on. So we're joining it up with the rest of that story. So that's the sort of way of changing the culture.
Okay. Thank you, Sohier. And again, I mean, there's so much that resonates there from that for me, and I'm, you know, hopefully many of you listening in. I mean, particularly me being from a Pakistani Muslim background, when it was realized I was infertile and I suggested adoption, my own mother said, "Oh no, adoption, you can't. You know, it has to be your own gene, you know, your own genetic pool." And I just thought, well, and there are so many aunties and uncles within our family who are infertile and don't have children. I mean, yeah. So thank you. That yeah, it's very important to hear that. But I think if people are doing it, the secrecy behind it, and I'll come back to Seetal later about talking about the stigma, but I want to ask Lenice whether I've listened to a few of your podcasts, which I think are amazing. And if anyone hasn't listened to the Period Story podcast, you should all sign up to this. Okay, I'm not being paid by anyone. This is just me telling you that you should all listen to this. And when you've talked to the women, Lenice, does it come up that, you know, women of color are not being supported in terms of the issues that we're discussing, in terms of stigma around fertility or infertility?
I mean, everyone's experience is different, but if I have to, have to generalize. If I think about the guests that have been on my podcast over the last 4 seasons, there are definitely themes that come up with the women of color, where they learn from an early age that periods are supposed to be painful. Menstrual health equals pain, emotional upheaval, and then that story persists where they accept pain as normal, and then it leads to menstrual health, reproductive health issues that then in the future impact on their fertility. But there is a narrative, certainly if I think about my guests who have come from Caribbean or African backgrounds, where periods are something that are seen as something quite dirty, something that is still quite taboo. And so for them, some of them even coming onto the podcast and talking about their menstrual health and then opening up into their reproductive health is a big deal, because that conversation was never open for them when they were younger. And so it's that telling their story in the kind of safe venue that I provide is almost cathartic, and it's a way of them changing the narrative and breaking the taboo, which then hopefully, I mean, I've heard stories from other guests where they have started talking about it more with their families, and it has broken down barriers.
Thank you. And I'm going to give you a follow-on question from that, Denise. So I love your period story podcast. And I'm miffed that I may never be on it because I don't have a first period story. Anyway, it's not about me. But I love that you asked this question, and you've just said, women come on to your program and they talk about, you ask, tell me about your first period story. And I was listening to you talk to another nutritionist a couple of weeks ago. I think it was last week, maybe. I can't remember her name, I'm afraid. But I love that she was so positive and so excited about her period, coming. So can you tell us more about why you chose to ask this question? What led you to this podcast as well?
And actually, thank you for asking me that, because it actually ties in with the conversation that we're having around reproduction. Because I thought to myself 2 years ago that I hear so many people talking about their birth stories, and typically it's always bad. People are so happy to share their bad birth stories. And I thought, well, why don't we hear stories about first periods? Like, wouldn't that be interesting? And not necessarily just interesting to me from a professional perspective. I thought, well, why isn't it interesting? And then I started to explore that that space, and it's been really enlightening. And the stories that I've heard, I mean, Joyce has been on the podcast, and her episode is fantastic. And the opening up of the thinking back to the first period, which for some of us is a momentous event, and some of us it's an event that we've forgotten, or others they just haven't had it at all. And then linking that openness that comes through talking about that and sharing the stories to then the openness that we're looking for when it comes to talking about the rest of reproduction and fertility, I think is really important.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you. Seetal, I'm going to ask you, in terms of the work that you do in the blogging, you're writing about stigma within the Asian community. Can you tell us more about, your experience, but also, what you know from in terms of, is there any research to back the stigma that goes with adoption, or not adoption, sorry, with the egg sharing or infertility, actually, generally?
I've been quite lucky, actually, on both sides of the family, immediate family and with friends. We've had nothing but support in terms of donor conception, and I know that that's not the case for everybody. So one of my cousins donated eggs to her sister, and this is going back about 15 odd years, and that resulted in a son. And so it is, I wouldn't say prevalent, but my family is aware of this, and we have discussed it openly. Although when you're younger, it's not something that you talk about around the table over a meal, you're just aware that it has happened. And so when our second clinic after our third cycle failed suggested using donor eggs because of the quality and quantity of my eggs, it didn't shock me so much. I don't recall being devastated by it. And it is sad, there is an element of grief associated with losing that genetic link to my child, but I don't feel it necessarily as strongly as others, because I just thought, well, if that gives me a stronger chance of success of having a family, I am willing to go down that road. It was harder for my husband because, as Shema was saying, it becomes a thing. You have to explain it. Even if you go down the non-anonymous donor route, you still have to then think of how you're going to introduce the donor conception story to your child. And that's something that you wouldn't do if you just conceive naturally. You sort of just get on with life and deal with the many challenges that will come your way. But this is an extra problem that we will have to deal with. or an issue, yeah. In terms of the wider stigma, I know that from the messages I've received and the conversations I've had via DM and friends and people who write to me, it is the lack of anonymity is a problem, because they don't necessarily want to disclose that information to everybody. Maybe they don't have such an understanding family, or they themselves want to keep it a private, personal matter. And so obviously, if you can go to India and find a donor, or go to somewhere like Greece or Spain, and it's anonymous, it's quick, it's generally cheaper than the treatment in the UK, from my understanding, that's what they would prefer to do.
Thank you. Joyce, do you want?
We've been having some chats. I've been answering some questions in the chat. So we've got Lucy Emerson on, and Lucy runs. Well, she might not run it now, but she did run the Sex Education Forum. I think she's still involved, which is work we did some work with them when we set up the UK Fertility Education Initiative, and I think we have a few problems. I think we have the fact that within any population, we just don't talk about women's health, women's issues. We can't even seem to say the word vagina and vulva in public, and people make an uproar. I recently tried to put a post on Instagram that talked about sex education. It got blocked. So we have that problem just globally. These topics are taboo, and the Eve Appeal have tried to get people to use these words, because if women don't know what's normal, then they can't know what's wrong, and then they hide with pain and suffering and with women's health issues that just don't get discussed. But from everything we've discussed so far today, I think within the ethnic communities, this is even, as Seetal said, this is something you discuss over the dinner table. Most people, don't discuss this anywhere in the world. And within certain communities, I can imagine it being even more taboo. And then we have some of the issues we've talked about, like infertility and loss, etc. We just don't talk about them. I want us to normalize these things. And Lucy's asked about education in schools. So we're running a school survey, and Rena, my student who's on the call, we want to look in different schools that have mainly certain ethnicities. Are these topics that they discuss? So we did do some work in a school, an all-girls school that was 97% Muslim a couple of years ago with Fertility Fest, and asked them some of these questions. Do they talk about any of these things? So we have got to change an enormous amount. Basically, we've got to get these issues out on the table so that women can know if there's something wrong and seek help. But we've also got to get over the issues in certain cultures where this is even more taboo.
So then I'm going to now following on from that, Joyce. So Shema, actually I was into how would you suggest it, but Shema, you can go ahead, Shema.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow on from what Joyce was saying, because and this is me stepping out from talking about my personal experience and talking about my work instead. But we just need a broader approach to sex and reproduction, because it needs to be a discussion about sexual well-being. It needs to be sex positive. I don't feel that we as women, certainly as racially minoritized women, feel able to own our sex lives and to own a sense of, having a right to an enjoyable sex life throughout our lifetimes. And most of my work is around menopause with women living with HIV, and the majority of those women are Black African. I mean, there's virtually no discussions about menopause. I mean, these are all the things that need to come into sex and relationship education. So it's not just about pregnancy or stopping getting pregnant. It has to be about enjoying sex, having safe, sex that's consensual, and what happens when your periods stop, as well as what happens when your periods start. It's close to my heart because I'm in my mid-40s, so that's probably why it matters so much.
I totally agree with you. We've just got so much to do. We started the UK Fertility Education Initiative in 2016, and now this is all of my research now. I've given up everything else. I've just realized we've just got we've set up an international group, and we're looking at people's two parts of research globally, people's knowledge and attitudes to their fertility, but that includes their reproductive health, everything about their reproductive health for men and women of all ages, all cultures, and then how we can make tools and validate the tools to help educate them. Because as you said, the menopause as well, if we've never educated women about the menopause, how are they going to know about it? And they will feel negative about it because they'll be bombarded with things in the media that are all doom and gloom. And I'm one of the positive menopause advocates, and it's a hard one. It's really hard. But, you know, even going back to Lenice about puberty and our periods, if you don't know what's normal, how are you going to know what's wrong? And if no one talks about it, and if your family, if your parents never talk to you about it, how are you going to, who do you go to? Who do you turn to when you think there might be something wrong? And for Sohier about FGM, you know, how many women are suffering in silence with issues because they just are too scared, too nervous to go and discuss this? So it's we're all here and we're all on the same page, but there's so much to do. And even for Asma, with, you know, your issues that you went through, you know, I've heard you speak several times about, you know, how your family reacted, etc. You know, and the doctors just coming and looking at you like, you know, oh, look at this specimen. You know, that we've got to normalize these conversations, but it's a huge task. But we're here today doing exactly that, trying to chip away.
Yeah. Seetal, you have a...
Hi, I just wanted to say, as part of the broader approach that Shema was discussing, so education in schools, through your family environment as well, Bollywood, I think, plays a big part, and that has helped to normalize things like adoption, alternate paths to parenthood. I saw that there was a film a couple of years ago, I think the title was Vicky something or other, about a fertility clinic and donor insemination. And for that to be a mainstream topic in a big Bollywood film with produced by John Abraham, who's a very well-known actor, I think that's incredible. There was also a film about periods, so The Padman. I don't know if it's still available on Netflix, and it reduced me to tears. It was absolutely wonderful to just see that being discussed, and then to get a better understanding. I'm Indian, but I didn't grow up in India. I'm born and raised in Leicester. So my upbringing is very different to a rural Indian village. And when the documentarian, when they would go and talk to the school kids about periods, they thought they were referring to class periods in school, not menstruation. And so the girls themselves couldn't even say the word because of all the shame and the stigma, the sense of dirtiness and embarrassment. So yeah, I think Bollywood is definitely helping drive that.
Yeah.
We're doing sorry, Asma, we're doing some research at the moment. This is something that I've just finished a book and I definitely need a few years off. But one thing I really am thinking about writing my second book is about rites and rituals around puberty, menstruation, fertility. And the work we've looked at this year, we found that around puberty in some cultures, it's the sort of coming of age celebrations, and some are negative, but some are celebratory of girls and boys are now coming of age. But menstruation, I mean, Lenice will know more about this than me, you know, then it's a shame. It's a shameful thing. It's a stigma. It's a dirty thing that women have to go through. And, you know, you don't want to, you put them away and lock them away, and they get sent to a hut or whatever. And then menopause, you know, some cultures, women are that now treated as the wise woman, but some of them, you know, thinking about what Sohier said about the needs of a woman to have a child, and if they're no longer able to have children, we're looking into whether there are cultures that then almost don't respect women anymore because they're not useful to society because they can't reproduce. Can I just say there was a good question from Ope on the chat about has anyone done any work around how your eating practices or habits impact on your reproductive health for people of African origin? I didn't know whether Lenice...
Lenice, I think. Yeah, Lenice, you want to comment?
Yeah, so, you know, there is basic principles that anyone with a period can take, but then people who of African heritage, there are specific things that they may want to consider especially when it comes to conditions like fibroids, which show non-cancerous growths that are inside or within the muscular lining of the uterus. And they're eating different things you can do through food to address this condition. They're about 80, I think the stat is in the US, 80% of Black women by the age of 50 are more likely to have fibroids. And hysterectomies are actually the most common procedure to remove fibroids. But hysterectomies, it's a major surgery and it has impact on fertility. But less commonly discussed is the impact of food on addressing the cause of fibroid growth, which is estrogen and excess estrogen in the body. So yes, I can give a long answer to that, but the short answer is yes.
Can I thank you for that, Lenise? And I know that the event's due to end in 5 minutes, but we can carry on to 2:30 if anyone can stay. And I know that I don't know if the guest speakers are able to stay until that point. I mean, the conversation is just flowing so nicely. I didn't want to stop you all. And yeah, and yeah, so I was going to say, so here, do you want to comment on that question that Joyce asked as well? I think you were nodding your head as we were listening to Lenise.
We about 2 months ago, interestingly, the Drive Time host Eddie Nestor on London radio actually addressed exactly this issue. He was talking about the issues about fibroids in the Black community and the impact on fertility, as well as all the things that you could do to help prevent them, treat them, and so on. Very much like periods and bringing periods on and making them regular, menopause and how to deal with that using the right foods, etc. And fibroids was one of the subject matters. And one of the things that came out of it, which was quite interesting, was the fact that, as Lenise has spoken about, the push was to always go for a hysterectomy, even if you're in your 20s with a heavy, fibroid uterus, which was a bit of a shock when you sort of hear that. And I think it came out of this whole picture that there was a lack of understanding that within the Black community, again, if fertility is not maintained for choice, that this has a huge impact on that community, on the woman and the community. So they were never offered alternatives or never informed of alternatives. The only thing put on the table was a hysterectomy. And it's not that dissimilar to the history of endometriosis. If you hear a lot of women who have endometriosis and the pain, the idea is you go in, clear out the pelvis and your pain will go away. And as somebody who does a lot of work in chronic pain management, and I sit on the European guidelines committee for it, that is absolutely the wrong approach. You have to look at the pain as a disease process rather than as a symptom of another disease process. So it's the same approach. So yes, there are people in certain cultures that advocate eat more of this, less of this. I mean, the traditional one is yams. Everybody will say, if you eat too much yam, it's got a lot of phytoestrogens in it. It makes it worse. Drugs which are progestogenic also make it worse. Foods that are progestogenic make it worse. So there's a lot of factors that come in. At the end of the day, I think the journey has to be very well clarified, and people need to just be educated, and choices need to be made. But it needs to be your choice, but based on the information. So you need to give as much evidence and information for people to follow.
Thank you, Sohier. Joyce, are there any other questions? I mean, I'm mindful that we haven't officially opened it up for Q&A, but I think we have, because we're looking at the chat. But
yes, Asma, I've been going through them and I've been answering everything.
Is there? Sorry.
Seetal said about adoption, but I think everything else. I'm just reading all my notes. I think one thing I wanted to pick up right at the beginning actually was, I think it was Shema that said, seeing women who look like you. And I think that I've heard that many times. I think that is so important. Today being International Women's Day, I do a lot of work with schools and careers, and if you don't see women in a role like engineering, president of the United States, prime minister, you know, politics, etc., then how are you going to think, yeah, that's something that I could do? And even more so when we're looking at race and reproduction, if you sit in the fertility clinic and no one else is of color, you know, how does that make you feel? You will always be feeling the odd one out. So it's so different. I don't have an answer, but I think it's something we need to be really aware about. We want to see people in all aspects of life that look like us. And being in a multicultural society has a lot of advantages, but it also has disadvantages. So I live in a very Caucasian middle-class area, and there are very few people of different races, and I know it's really difficult. So I did put a comment about adoption. Actually, that brings me to one family I know here adopted a child from China many years ago, and that was something that child said, nobody here looks like me. So I'm in a country, in a area, in a town where there's no one else even my age who's Chinese. So there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I was going to say that in terms of I've been for this session, it probably wasn't apparent, but I've been reading a lot on so reproductive research, and there's a lot of anthropological work coming out now, particularly following, you know, Black Lives Movement as well, but that, and Shema and Seetal, you both said that actually you feel slightly privileged because you were able to pay for your treatment. However, even if you're paying for your treatments, there's anthropological evidence to suggest that you're still more disadvantaged than if you were a white person or a white woman. So I think, you know, how do we address these barriers that, you know, women who, you know, whose families, parents who moved here many years ago from different parts of the world to more westernized nations for better lives, you know, we're still being disadvantaged and disproportionately. I mean, we know from COVID-19 as well that more people from minoritized groups are disadvantaged, dying and sick from COVID-19. And we know that this isn't necessarily to do with genetics, although that's the argument that was, you know, branded about, but we know it's more to do with structural racism. And, you know, how do we, as Joyce puts it, you know, how do we get past this? I mean, and Seetal, you said that the research that you're looking into focuses more on I think you put the word Caucasian, I think, in there, but white, I took that to mean white women. But I think we need to do more research looking at minoritized groups. And I put it to you, Joyce, as Professor in Reproductive Science, to lead us.
I was just writing something in the chat. I was just saying in the chat actually that I haven't pressed send yet, but I've said to everyone that, and I did send this earlier, I said we are opening up the conversations and we are starting because we're just so far away, and as we've said already, we mustn't forget about the men. The men are even further behind us. So I think it's absolutely amazing that everyone's shared their story and their experiences, and and Sohar's work. It's just amazing that these things now are really happening that will help people. But I think culturally we've got a really big issue that we've got to. It's going to take decades to change the culture. I mean, those people that are parents now of young children, or hopefully soon parents of young children, you know, we'll have those conversations with our children. That's 20 years away before they're adults and they can help move this forward. So we have got a lot of work, but we are all, you know, those people that are doing work on social media, I feel really strongly, and we had this conversation last night, we had Emma Haslett on, who's a journalist and runs a podcast called Big Fat Negative. And I really appreciate everyone's work that they're doing on social media, because I do think, I know there's some, I was trolled last week for a comment I made, but we'd have to ignore that and park it, and we have to get these messages out there. And I think social media is a way of doing that. So I think everyone that is doing that, you know, it's a really, really valuable. This is why I say yes to every podcast, because I think if you know 100 people watch it, that's fine. That's fine. Let's just get going and get the stories ticking over. But we will have to finish soon. If we've and we will have one. Should we launch the last poll now, and then we can still chat after? I just wanted to get some feedback on. Here we go. On if people found the event useful, and we've had several people write comments in the chat and said they really have. But it's always good to listen to everyone's voice. So in the chat, it will be those that are a bit more confident to speak. But the great thing about a poll, it gives everyone the chance to give their say. So I think almost everyone, 90% have voted. So I'll just share that with you now, because it's really quite clear. So everyone has said yes, they have really found this event useful. And as I said, the comments in the chat as well have been really amazing. So I don't know, Asma, did you want to let everyone just do a quick wrapping up?
Yeah, I think Shema had a comment before, and then I think I'll let everyone say the last few words. So Shema, did you have your hand up?
I did, but I can use it as my wrapping up comment.
Okay,
to be efficient.
Do you want to start?
Yes. So thank you, everyone. It's been a real privilege to sort of share this space with you and to talk about some really difficult things. Just going back to what you were saying, Asma, is how do we tackle these really sort of big structures? And also following on from Joyce, I really believe that the personal is political. So that this is not for everyone to be open about their reproductive journeys, but those of us of colour who feel that that is right for us, don't underestimate the power that has. I've been doing it for a few years now, and the number of people who've been in touch with me, especially Asian women, who've said, well, I've seen you post about your family, and you know, how much you love your children, you've made me feel like I could do this too. So it's just to appreciate that your voice that you may think is small actually has huge power in terms of society.
Lenice, do you want to go next? Thank you, Shema, for that. That's it. Yeah.
Again, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for all the insightful questions. I completely agree with Shema. The personal is political, and we have power in our individual stories and voices. And by talking and having conversations like this, and even the conversations that you have with your friends on Zoom or soon in the pub, they make a difference, and they create more comfort in talking about things that were previously taboo. And the goal is to make these conversations easier and easier to have, so that people, when they have issues, they're not scared to go and seek support, and they know where to turn rather than feeling hesitant to go try and resolve their issues. For those of you who are menopausal, for those of you who are watching who are menopausal, there is a great new podcast called Menopause Whilst Black. And because menopause is or has been a taboo in the Black community, and it's run by a woman called Karen Arthur, who has become she's a fashion designer, and she's become a menopause advocate. So that's something to check out as well. But thank you again for inviting me onto today's panel.
No, thank you, Lenice, as well. It's just amazing that you're here. Seetal, would you like to say a few things to wrap up?
Thank you very much again for having me as well. And it has been fantastic to hear different perspectives and to learn from one another and to answer the questions from people as well, to be able to share my experience to help others. And as Lenice and Shema both said, I am very passionate about using my own personal ongoing experience to diversify the dialogue. I think it is time to change the narrative. I also want people to be able to identify and for their stories to be reflected on social media. So it is not, as we said, infertility doesn't discriminate. So even if you don't want to share your story, if you can just listen to a podcast, have access to that information, read someone's caption, and then DM them maybe and have a private conversation, and then they will feel much less alone and abnormal. And even with all the support that I have, I sometimes still feel incredibly lonely. And, you know, it's hard to stamp out that sense of failure because your body isn't doing what nature intended. So if anybody wants to DM me as well, I'm at Savla Fair on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and I'm happy to have a chat.
Thank you, Seetal. And yes, I will be DMing you myself. Yes, I'm sorry that you feel lonely, and yeah, it's good that you're reaching out to people and that you're telling us this is yeah, it's very moving. So here, wrapping up points.
Thank you once again. It's been a really, really good meeting. I think what's really nice is listening to journeys and stories, but also what people are doing, which is positive, helping people reach a better place, not just on a physical front, but on a mental health front, because once we have the conversation, it opens up so many more doors. And just knowing that you can have that conversation is it makes a huge difference to your life. And certainly within the community I come from, and just taking into account all the issues that come from the FGM background, just knowing that more women can now talk about it freely and approach all the issues that go in their life more easily has made a huge difference to us. We feel we're making a difference. It's small steps, but we're getting there. And it's lovely to hear everybody else's stories, because I think it's only by bringing it together in a forum like this that you realize just how much good work is going on, and more and more people will benefit. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone. For sharing their wonderful stories, and thank you to the audience for asking questions and taking part in our poll. And I want to say that the 7% of you who've experienced racism, we need to make that 0. You know, that shouldn't be a 7%. I know it's a low number, but it's still 7% of people who are on this panel as guests. So that is not okay. And yeah, so personal stories are powerful, and you know, we know that, you know, when we're growing up in our different backgrounds, that people, you know, stories are used all the time, and it's great that our panelists today use, you know, whether it's a podcast, whether it's from Instagram, blogs, that you share your personal stories. And I think it's reaching out to so many people of different backgrounds. And I think what you said about being a brown person, seeing somebody who looks similar to you does help. And that's really important. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and keep doing that. And I just want a round of applause from me to you all. Thank you so much. Okay, Joyce, did you have any final words?
Yes, thank you all so much. It's been a really, I knew it was going to be a great session, but it was absolutely fantastic. And I feel a lot of the right movement in the right direction. And as Asma said, we've all got to keep doing what everyone's doing. And thank you all the participants for engaging with wonderful questions. And I will put the video up on YouTube as soon as I can. It takes a bit of a while to come through on Zoom. I'll hopefully have it up within the next few hours. And then please feel free to share this with anyone else who you might think would benefit. So thank you all so much, everyone.
Yeah. You're a phenomenal woman, in the words of Maya Angelou.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Asma.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Asma.